Morning everyone, and welcome back to what is video number 6 in this series of planning washes and managing edges as I work through this lovely scene of the River Arun in Sussex. In this video I'm going to be focusing on two areas. First is the boats, which form a focal point to the painting. I'm going to be putting on some washes and some detail there. And as I do that, I'm going to show you how I combine certain edges as I put those washes on, which will then allow me to define form and individual shapes of the boats and details once those washes have dried. Once that's done, I'm going to move on to the left bank again, but this time what I'm going to do is put an area of shadow over some of those lovely reeds on the bank, and that will give it a bit of extra definition, and it will also enable me to connect the reflections just underneath the bank into that part of the painting. For that, I'm going to be using a technique called glazing. I've mentioned this before and we've spoken about this, but just a little refresher for you if it's a term that you're not so familiar with. Glazing is essentially putting a pale wash, well, sometimes it doesn't necessarily need to be that pale, but a very liquid wash of transparent watercolour over what we've already painted, such that what's underneath will show through nicely, but there will be a clear delineation between areas of shade on the bank and areas that are more sunlit. I'm going to show you how to do that because if it's a technique that you're not familiar with, it can be a little bit tricky. There's a couple of things that are useful to keep in mind when using glazing as a technique in your paintings. I think there's very little more to say at this point, so let's get stuck into the painting. Let's start on those boats and see how things progress. Okay, this is the first area to tackle here, these boats that are grouped together on the riverside. I want you to think about these in much the same way as we thought about the painting before we put any paint on here at all. So over the sky and over the river area, if you remember, we put a lot of loose washes, wet into wet, painted very pale to establish the paler tones and the brighter hues in the painting, as we did when we started dropping in colours here and over here. I'm going to do the same thing, in as much as I'm just putting in these paler washes so that I can then put darker washes on over the top. I'm doing it so that I'm not having to match up too many edges. You'll see that as we go round. But what's different here is that this is a much smaller area. It's more localized, and so it's easier to control. There's no need to paint large wet on wet washes because we've got everything in a nice tight controlled area. We've still got to be careful with the way that we match our edges up, but in many ways it's a slightly easier, more controllable passage of the painting to deal with, even though there's a degree of complexity in it and there's a degree of detail that we need to be mindful of. So I've got some colours mixed up here, and what I'm going to do is just start off with the palest and the brightest wash first, which is this mix of raw sienna, and I've just dropped a little bit of permanent rose in there as well, just to give it some warmth. And what I want to do is start at the top of this area and just put in some colour on these boats. And I'm covering over areas that you can see would be darker, so this would have a little blue cover or awning over the top of it, but that's not an issue. I'm just going to put a little darker colour, this shadow colour, over this side here where that support is. I'm happy for that to all run together. And then I'm going to keep coming down with this sunlit colour. Now, because I'm painting over the top of a blue here, it has the potential to go a little bit greenish, which is why I put the permanent rose in there. We're painting a yellow over blue and it can create green. So be mindful of that when you make these little washes over the top of areas that you've already painted. And we keep going. And I'm going to come right down into the cabin of this boat here. Now, because this is white paper underneath showing through, you can see that I've got an entirely different colour registering here. It's more muted at the top where I painted over the blue, but here you can see the sunlit really catching the cabin of the boat. And if you remember, we left this area unpainted by putting some masking fluid over the top. And now we're just adding a little bit of highlight to it for the sun. What have we got behind here? Okay, we've got the hull of the boat behind it. Again, that's a darker colour, so I can let that all run in together. But all I'm worried about at this moment in time are the highlights on these boats. And we'll come over the top here. You don't need to paint right up to that line here. These are two very pale washes. Just leave that. It adds a little bit of sparkle to your painting. I'm taking a damp brush and painting out this area here because I want to start again on the stern of the boat. I'm going to be painting this down into these reflections all in one wash. So I want to focus on that as a specific area once this is all dried. I can see that there's some highlight on the top of the little mooring buoy here, so let's put that in. And I think the sun is just catching some of this paraphernalia that's on top of the jetty here, so we can put some warm colour there too. While I have this mix, I'm just going to paint this area of the boat here in the foreground. With a damp brush, I'll just get rid of that line on the top. I will explain why shortly. And I'm going to keep some warmth coming down through here, but I want this to be painted out. I don't want any hard edges here because the reflection's going to be going over the top of this. There we are. Now I wanted the edge to be soft here because I'm going to put this blue canvas cover that's over the top of the boat on later, but I'm not going to do it in this video because if you recall, I said that the top of this and the colour here is very similar in tone to the tone of the dark riverbank behind it. So I'm actually going to do that little element there when I fill in all these gaps in between the railings and the posts and the ladders and things like that. So just keep in mind where you want your edges to be showing crisp, where you want them to be nice and soft. I want a soft one here, so I'm going to do that as I paint this area. Keep these things in your mind. Okay, now that the pale wash has dried, that's established the brightness, the sun catching these boats, I can start to put in some shadow colour in various places. I've got this usual mix here of a blue, a red and a yellow, French ultramarine, I think there's a bit of permanent rose in here, a little bit of raw sienna too, and we can just start to define some of these shapes a little bit more. I'm not quite sure why I missed that area there, but I did. It doesn't really matter too much. These posts that are in front of this boat are all a lot darker, so it doesn't matter if we paint over those. But what I am going to do is just paint that out so that the sun is just catching that edge here, and this little bit here is in shade. That's fine. Keep it coming down the paper, and then we come into this boat here, which is very much in shade. So let's keep that this nice sort of blue purpley colour. And you can see here there is a little railing on the front of the first boat. We can either put that in later with a little bit of titanium white, or we can just paint round it now. Well, let's just try painting round it and see what happens there. Now this boat is connected to the river bank, and it's slightly darker through here as well. So what I'm going to do is bring some of this slightly muddy colour in. Now you can see it's quite a bit darker in here, so I'm just mixing up some darker tone of warm sepia, French ultramarine, connecting that into the riverbank. And I'm bringing it down the side of this boat, so my darker tone here is giving this some definition. And this is a reflected area in here, so let's just suggest a few simple reflections like that. There's a pole or something just lying across this little jetty, just here. It just gives a little bit of detail. Now, as you can see, it's quite dark underneath the boat here, and also underneath the little jetty that it's sitting up against. And I'm just waiting for this to get to the point where it's almost dry, and I'm just going to put a mark in to suggest the bottom of the boat there. And then I want to run some darker tone just across here like this. I may have just gone a little too early there with that line, so let's try it again. That's better. That has a little more definition to it. Good. This is an area that's in shade. We don't need to be too worried about what's going on here, but we just want to suggest some changes in the tone between the hull of the boat, the little jetty or pontoon that it's on, and the reflections that are below it. And I think that's fine. Now, while that's drying, I'm just going to put in the cover on that boat at the back. It's a lovely bright blue, and I need to make sure I come on this side of the support there so that that's showing. It's possibly too dark. Actually, it's not too bad, actually. It's not quite the right shape, actually, the way I've drawn it, but that's okay, it doesn't matter too much. It comes down underneath the support here. And then finishes across the back of the boat there. I think I'm going to leave those little marks in there. It just suggests a few little undulations in the cover. And there's just a little bit here on this side of the support. So now, as you can see, it's not all one tone. Some of it is darker in places than others, particularly under the support here. So let's just drop some of this dark colour in while this is all wet. Same too here, it's just a little bit darker through there. And round the top on that side. There we go. And I'm starting to paint carefully now because I'm defining parts of the painting, and I can do that with all these washes that have been put on before being in place. The cover on here is a nice dark blue, so let's put that in. Ideally, I should be using a slightly larger brush for this, but I'm not. And then there's another dark cover just on top of this boat here. I'm just going to leave a little gap in between the two just to suggest a little bit of room there. Now while this is still damp, I'm just going to take out a little bit of paint here with a damp brush just to lighten that up through there a little bit. That's good enough. And then I just want to put a little bit of shadow on this part of the cabin here. That gives some definition to the back of the boat. And just across here, there's also a little bit of shade. And I'm being careful not to run up into that dark area above it. And I'm just leaving a little gap there. That's fine when you're doing these intricate shapes and you're just matching them up to one another. You can't plan absolutely everything with soft all the time. And in little areas like this, if you have an area where you want to keep painting but you don't want to match that up exactly, just leave a little gap there. It acts as a highlight on the top of the boat. That's perfectly okay. Put a little more dark on this side, I think. What I should have done is I should have just kept going with that little area of shade that I was painting, because of course it's in here. So let's just put that in now. And it runs in to this area of glass in the door. It's just a little white area there. You can see it's darker above it and below, but let's just put that in there too. And there's a little bit of shadow just falling across here and down the side of the boat too. And you can see I've got an overlap happening here. I'm coming round and I'm leaving that nice highlight on the top of the marker buoy. I've got an overlap there. What am I going to do with that? Well, I just get a damp brush and bring it across what I've painted. It's gone. Just make sure that feathers out enough. But it's such a pale tone, but instead of having a little overlapping line there, I've just dragged it across what I've already painted, which is now dry, and it looks great. I'm just going to soften this up a little bit as well, because it's not a particularly hard edge there on that shadow on the side. There we are, that's just enough to suggest that it's there. Now what I'm going to do with the rigger brush is paint the door frames in this lovely sort of orange colour. Bit of raw sienna, bit of burnt sienna. They're quite strong in tone. And I'm going to put these on now before I paint the dark cabin interior. Now there's just a little bit of this coming over the top here. Let's put that in. May as well while we've got it all on the brush. And then paint carefully with your rigger brush, or your liner, whatever you call it. Now, I don't want you to worry about matching this up so precisely that there's no overlap here. If you get a little bit of overlap when you paint things like door frames and what's inside those doors or windows, sometimes it's okay to have a little overlap. You can use that to your advantage because, of course, these things are three-dimensional. So frames cast a little bit of shadow on the glass or what's behind it, and so it doesn't really matter, providing you're being precise with your brushwork. There's something else there in that colour, so let's put that in too. Okay, I've got this dark colour. I've just mixed a little bit of red into it. It seems to have a red quality to it. I'm assuming this is the back of the seat or something like that, but I'm not 100% sure. Again, be careful here with your brushwork. If you're more comfortable using a smaller rigger brush while you're doing this, then do that. That's perfectly okay. Now I just need to wait for those frames to dry perfectly before I put in some darker tone there. That's really important. I don't want that all running together. If I was painting something in a boat here or further down the river, it wouldn't bother me so much, but this is right in my focal point here, and I want this crispness, I want this precision of detail, which I know some people frown on, but I like it. It's what I see when I paint. I like this type of detail, so I'm going to be careful when I paint it. Okay, that's dried now, so let's continue the seat just across here. And then we have a darker shadow just through here. Paint inside these frames. Keep it as crisp as you can. It's a bit paler near the top here, so it's okay. And then it seems to get darker again as we come near the bottom, so pick up some darker tone on the brush. And just leave that in there. Okay, so that's the door frame done, that's the interior painted. We may need to do a little bit more there, but probably not, but that's okay for the moment. Now what I want to do is paint it in the stern of the boat and connect it to the shadow on the marker buoy, this little pontoon here, and their associated reflections. And I'm going to be painting this quite fluid. I'm going to need to move quickly, and then I'll show you how we put these reflections in. They're quite subtle. We don't want to overwork them, but there's a definite way of doing this that I think works quite nicely. So I've got these colours here that are mixed up at the moment, and I'm going to paint this warmer colour across the back of the boat. As you can see, it's quite dirty in places on the back of this boat, and that's important because, you know, this isn't the most prestigious yacht harbour you're ever going to find, and these boats sometimes don't see much action. I'm just going to warm up this brown colour here for the pontoon. Again, keep this bottom edge nice and wet because I'm going to need to pick that up in a minute. And then above it, you know, there's all manner of things going on here, and we can come back to this, but just a few marks to suggest ropes and poles and little bits of paraphernalia that are in there, and then the shadow side to the buoy, something like that. Now what I want is a slightly darker version of the hull for the shadow. you can see that it is tonally darker. So keep that in mind as you paint it in. And I'm going to do the same for the jetty here. Because I'm thinking reflections, I'm painting horizontally, because the water is very slightly rippled, even though what is reflected moves down. And we come down to just about here. You can see there's a little bit of warmth just reflecting down from the doors. But we don't want that to be too obvious, so we'll just drop it in and then phase it out with a combination of a damp brush and finger, like that. It's just enough to suggest that it's there. Okay, now, while this is drying up, I want to put some of this dirty growth around the bottom of the hull. You can see actually it's just come up the side a little bit, so we'll put some in there. It's really quite mucky down in this corner. Just above here, it really does seem to get quite grubby, so let's just put that in too. Then we're going to need to get really dark with French ultramarine, warm sepia, or burnt sienna, it doesn't really matter, burnt umber, anything like that. That just gets you this nice dark colour. And I'm going to drop that in a couple of places. Just underneath the buoy there. And then certainly underneath this pontoon. And then I'm going to run it across the back of the boat. And this is a really important way to paint boats, because now what I've done is I've separated the hull from its reflection, and that allows the boat to look as though it's sitting down in the water as opposed to just being stuck on top of it. You can see that there's some darker values in the shadow that fall down there and just on this side too. Now this seems to have dried much quicker than I expected, and that is because I am using something I hardly ever use, which is a hairdryer, just to speed this along a little bit quicker, all for your benefit, you see, so that I can get this done and out there on YouTube and paint it quickly. But it's dried up, that's okay, I've got ways of managing that. In fact, it's quite a useful little lesson. So I think we're about where we want to be with this, but I'm going even darker with this, because now it's almost completely dry. I can just make that line there even crisper, and yet it's all still soft. There we are, that's nice. Now I said that had dried up, and I don't really want that hard edge there. So what I can do, now that's all dried, I can soften it a little. And I'm using this synthetic brush, and I'm just going to paint a tiny little amount of water over that edge. And then just drag it down a little bit. Do that a little bit more, just one more time perhaps. Just drag it down, and there we are, it's soft again. So don't worry if you end up with an edge that you didn't particularly like, there are ways of dealing with this. Now hopefully you can see that off the back of the boat here are some other reflections, and we want to put those in. So there is something here that is coming down, and I'm starting it off with a hard edge, and then with a damp brush I'm just going to drag that down here and then encourage it further with my finger until it's pretty much gone. There's more on this side of the boat too, so again, start it off with a few hard edges, and then with a damp brush just drag it down, soften it with the finger, and that's reflecting nicely. Next to it you can see there's some brighter reflections. I'm going to show you how I'm going to put those in very shortly, but for the time being let's just leave this as it is. There is more detail to go onto these boats, of course, but in terms of the washes here, I'm comfortable that this is starting to come together quite nicely. I've got quite a dark blue on the boat here, so let's just put that in. There we are, nice and crisp. We want that detail. As I said previously, we're not going to concern ourselves too much with the cover that's on top of that. That's for another time. Let's leave that to dry. I've come down a little bit too far with this blue, but do you know what? It doesn't really matter too much. I'm going to wait for that to dry and then we'll reflect this in this area here. But there's not too much work to be done here because this reflection is largely painted negatively by the dark reflection of the riverbank around it. So we need to be careful there, but I'll put that in shortly. Well, I said I'd show you how to achieve these slightly paler reflections here, and I've just done one here. And it's just by getting a damp flat brush and lifting some of this paint out very carefully and just blotting as you go, and then cleaning your brush out and doing a little bit more. And the key here is keep the line a little bit wavy and don't scrub too hard, but it's just enough to slightly lighten that area, and then we can pick out some highlights once we come to put some detail on at the end. But for now, that's all I need, just to create the sense that it's just slightly lighter here, reflecting the right-hand side of the cabin. It looks a bit obvious, even though it's still a subtle mark, but once we put some ripples across this area of reflection, you'll see that it all comes together quite nicely. Now I'm just going to paint the reflections that I want on the back of the boat here. Very similar to how I did it here. But what I need to do is just put some clear water across here, just so I'm getting a soft edge when I paint in the grime that's accumulated at the bottom of the boat. And I let that all run up into there, that's nice. And then the reflection is slightly darker than the boat. And I'll paint that in now. It comes down into this darker band. Which is the blue reflecting. And I don't want to do any more than that here because I'm going to be coming over the top of this with additional ripples and creating a little bit more definition and sense out of that reflection. What I do want to do though is just drop in the dark that's running down there while this is still wet. That's reflecting down. Nice. And then as we did previously, we'll just run a line along the bottom of the boat here so that it sits it down in the water. That's all we need to do at this stage. That's ready for further definition from the riverbank and the canopy, and then the reflections as I move into this area in a later video. Right, let's turn our attention to the left riverbank, and I'm going to show you a glazing technique that allows me to put shadows across the reeds that are here on the bank. That will give it extra form and definition, but not only that, it will provide me with a way of connecting this riverbank into some of the reflections that fall across this side of the painting. Now, what I'm about to paint is difficult. A good glazing technique requires a number of things. Firstly, you need to have a nice soft brush that can hold plenty of paint. You need to have plenty of wet paint ready to use in the glaze as you paint it across the top of what's already here. Ideally, you will be using pigments that are more transparent than opaque, and you will be painting with a very light touch. You don't want to disturb what's on the paper here, even though it's dry, and even though most papers are very good at holding on to the paint that you have already painted. But if you start scrubbing around as though you're painting the garden shed, you're just going to end up with an area here that's completely muddy. So much care is required, and what I'm going to do is start off with the shadow and then bring that down into the water. You can see that there are some areas that are highlighted, and I need to make sure that the reflections that I put in take account of what's above, i.e. what's being reflected. So where the bank's warmer, I need my reflections and these ripples that I paint across the water to reflect that colour difference. There's a lot going on here, and it needs to be done all in one go. It needs to be painted quickly. And to be perfectly honest, there's very little you can do about it. If it doesn't quite work out right first time round, you just have to live with it. So let's have a go. I've got my shadow colour mixed up here. Test these out. Make sure that they are dark enough or pale enough, because you can't really modify them once they're dry. So get that right. That's the shadow colour. I've got a dark colour here for the darker reflections. I've got a sunlit colour here for the brighter reflected areas. I've still got some darks up here if I need to drop those in. To start with, I'm just going to put some clear water up here, because I mentioned in a previous video that there's just a little gap that seems to run through here. So let's get some shadow colour and paint up into the grass here. Soft edged on the top where it's running up there, but hard edge underneath. And then we come down around here. Just need to soften that a little more through there with the damp brush. I'm just going to warm that up ever so slightly. And then let's put some shade onto the riverbank here. Pick up more paint. You've got to apply this very softly. We're coming right down to the water's edge, and I'm keeping that lovely and wet. Okay, there seems to be a gap through there. And that's about as far as it goes. Now with my damp brush, again, I can just soften this in a few places just to help it sit in nicely with the reeds here. That's nice, and I can keep it coming down over here and into the river. There's also some through here as well, so I'll put some in there too on the bank. And now I'm ready to go with my reflections. So let's pick up the bottom of this shadow. You can see these running out across here. Let's put in some of the sunlit ones, which are up here reflecting across from this sunlit bit of the bank. Plenty of paint on. Oh, but I've just gone into the cabin of the boat there, but hey, that's okay. We can deal with that. Warmer reflections now coming out here. Now, as I did with the boats, we can start to put in some dark values along here, just where bank meets water. Make a bit more of that edge there, that's quite nice. It's a soft edge, but it's an edge all the same. It's where the riverbank meets the river and we've got these reflections, and that's quite nice. Also, while you're doing this, it gives you an opportunity to put in a couple of dark areas. So let's just put one here, for example. And then I can reflect these downwards. I'm going to do the same over here. Put in some darks on the riverbank. And keep those reflections coming down, just here for example. Just let that drop down here, let it come down. Let's change up to the rigger. Okay, let's not get too fussy over here. Let's leave it alone. I'm happy with how the shadows have added some extra definition to the riverbank. We've now got some nice sunlit areas, some in shade. We've got darker reflections. We've got sunlit reflections. But most importantly, these are all running together. There is clearly an edge between the bank and the river, but it's soft and it's suggested by dropping in that line while everything was just damp. The same as we did to the bottom of the boats here. It creates and suggests that boundary without a crisp, explicit edge to it. And that looks perfect for where this is in the painting. So in the middle distance, not at our focal point. The key here is not to play around too much, but while I've got this colour on the palette, I'm thinking ahead. I may as well just finish off with a few small ripples, just extending out from the side of the boat here. Just change up the colour slightly, keep it going in places. And now we're getting a really nice sense of the river moving around through the countryside, working its way ultimately out to the English Channel on the Sussex coast. Rather nice. This is damp. It has to be left alone. I am now going to remove myself from this before I start fiddling and making it look much worse than I would want it to. So I think that's it for the time being. Know when it's time to stop. Well, I think I've made some more progress there. I'm happy with the boats. I've got some basic washes on there. I've got the boats sitting down in the river and I've started to establish the reflections. It provides me with a base or a foundation from which to apply details when I come to finish off the painting. But I'm not at that stage yet. Putting too much detail into that area now would be a mistake. We need to bring other parts of the painting further forward. I'm particularly pleased with how the riverbank and the reflections worked out. By painting that shadowy glaze over the reeds, it's given them some form, it's given them some definition. We have a lovely contrast between areas that are in shade, areas that are sunlit, and it has connected the riverbank into the river itself by allowing that glaze to run down and picking it up on its bottom edge and painting that into the reflections. That is a difficult technique to get right. There's a lot going on. You need to paint quickly. Have your colours ready, have your brushes at hand and work with plenty of wet paint and keep it moving quickly. Just listening to me explaining that isn't actually going to make it any easier for you to do it. And I hope you understand that. All I'm telling you is the techniques that I use to connect up areas of the painting, to plan my washes, manage these edges. But ultimately, you're going to need to do it and practice it over and over again until you feel confident painting passages like that in your own paintings. Sometimes it's very easy to think that watercolour painting and painting the landscape is very much about taking the right tutorial or listening to the right piece of instruction and there you go, you're up and running. I wish I could say it was, but I'm afraid it's not. The instruction is important, it is helpful up to a point, but ultimately you've got to make those brush strokes, you've got to mix those colours, you've got to get the timing right, you've got to understand how much to apply, and it's very physical and it's very mechanical, and practice is the only way forward. But I hope you've been able to see that we've been able to bring areas of the painting together, areas of the painting forward, and I think we're ready now to start doing some work around the jetties, defining those with negative painting, again, revealing edges, losing edges, and then we'll move those reflections down into the river. And then it'll be a case of just putting some details on to finish everything off. So once again, thanks ever so much for watching. If you're new to the channel and you haven't subscribed, please do so. That's really helpful. If you've liked the video, click on the like too. And actually, if you have already subscribed, maybe just subscribe again, because there are some funny shenanigans that go on from time to time in YouTube, and subscriptions that you thought you had may be no longer there. So just click on the subscribe anyway, and then you'll be good to go. Particularly if you click on the bell icon, you'll get a notification when the next video is posted to the channel. Anyhow, that's all for now. Hope you enjoyed it. Happy painting, and I look forward to seeing you next time.